When a corrupt judge tried to humiliate Pam Bondi in his courtroom, he had no idea what was coming. Pam Bondi straightened her crisp white blouse and adjusted her neatly pulled back hair as she prepared to enter the courthouse. Most lawyers arrived in groups, chatting confidently, but Pam preferred to work alone. She had earned her law degree decades ago and had since risen to prominence as Florida's first female attorney general from 2011 to 2019, and now as the U.S. Attorney General under President Trump, confirmed in February 2025. Today, however, she was stepping into a smaller arena, representing Elellanar Wilson, a 72-year-old widow fighting to keep her family home from a fraudulent foreclosure. The opposing side was Preston and Associates, a powerful firm with deep ties to the judicial system. "You sure you're up for this?" asked Richard Barnes, a colleague who'd met her at the courthouse entrance, his weathered face showing concern. Pam nodded. "Someone has to stand up for Mrs. Wilson. She'll lose everything if we don't." "Just be careful in there," Richard warned. "Judge Montgomery has a reputation. They don't call him the Hammer for nothing." "I'm aware," Pam replied simply, her voice steady despite the challenge ahead. Judge William Montgomery had been on the bench for over 20 years, known for harsh rulings, especially against those challenging large financial institutions, with rumored financial ties to the very banks involved in Mrs. Wilson's case. "I'm prepared," she added, her tone resolute. "Don't let him intimidate you," Richard said. "That's his favorite tactic." "I won't," Pam promised. As they entered the courtroom, Pam recognized several attorneys from Preston and Associates, their tailored suits and confident smirks meant to intimidate. James Preston himself, the firm's lead counsel, was present, unusual for a routine foreclosure case. "They brought out the big guns," Richard whispered. "Why would Preston himself show up for this?" Pam replied softly. "Because something isn't right with this case, and they know I know it." Mrs. Wilson was already seated at the defendant's table, her weathered hands trembling slightly. Pam gave her a reassuring smile as she sat beside her. "Everything will be all right," she told Mrs. Wilson, hoping she was right. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Montgomery." "Be seated," Judge Montgomery commanded, his voice resonating with authority. At 65 years old, connected to the city's elite, and rumored to be eyeing a political run after retirement, he was an institution. First case, Midwest Banking Corporation versus Elellanar Wilson. "Foreclosure proceeding," the clerk announced. Judge Montgomery's eyes locked onto Pam, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Counsel, identify yourselves for the record," he instructed. James Preston stood, his voice smooth and practiced. "James Preston of Preston and Associates, representing Midwest Banking Corporation, Your Honor." Pam rose next. "Pam Bondi, representing Mrs. Elellanar Wilson, Your Honor." "Ms. Bondi," Judge Montgomery said, drawing out her name, "I believe this is the first time I've seen the Attorney General in my courtroom." "I typically handle matters at a federal level, Your Honor," Pam responded politely, "but this case required my direct attention." The judge nodded, a thin smile appearing. "Well, I trust you'll find our proceedings straightforward. Mr. Preston, you may begin." Preston launched into his opening statement with confidence. "The bank's records show missed payments, proper notification procedures, and standard foreclosure protocols were followed. Mrs. Wilson defaulted, and the bank is within its rights to seize the property." Pam listened quietly, taking occasional notes, her calm demeanor masking the discrepancies she'd spent months documenting. "Thank you, Mr. Preston," Judge Montgomery said, his tone notably warmer than when addressing Pam. "Ms. Bondi, your opening statement." Pam stood, portfolio in hand. "Your Honor, we contend that this foreclosure is fundamentally fraudulent. Mrs. Wilson's payment history shows no delinquency until the bank's computer system was upgraded last year. We have documentation proving all payments were made on time." Judge Montgomery's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, counsel." "We have the evidence to support it, Your Honor," Pam replied firmly. "I'm sure you believe you do," the judge said, his condescension barely concealed. "Proceed with your evidence presentation, but I advise you to be very certain before alleging fraud against a respected financial institution." "I'm quite certain, Your Honor," Pam said unfazed. Pam presented her case methodically. As you can see, Your Honor, Mrs. Wilson's automatic payments continued to be withdrawn from her account, she explained, displaying the bank statements. Yet somehow they weren't credited to her mortgage. Judge Montgomery interrupted, sounding bored. Computer errors happen, counsel. That hardly constitutes fraud. If it were just a computer error, the situation would have been corrected when Mrs. Wilson brought it to the bank's attention, Pam continued. Instead, they added late fees, refused to acknowledge the payments she could prove she made, and fast-tracked the foreclosure despite her 40 years of perfect payment history. James Preston stood. Your Honor, while Ms. Bondi's storytelling is entertaining, the facts remain clear. Our records show the payments weren't received. Perhaps Mrs. Wilson's evidence is the result of her own record-keeping errors. Pam noticed Judge Montgomery nodding slightly at Preston's argument. Furthermore, Preston continued, given Mrs. Wilson's age and the documented early signs of cognitive decline in her medical records. Objection, Pam interrupted sharply. Mrs. Wilson's medical records aren't relevant to this proceeding and weren't subpoenaed or submitted as evidence. How did you come to possess the defendant's medical information, Mr. Preston? Judge Montgomery asked, clearing his throat. Preston hesitated. General discovery, Your Honor. No medical records were requested or provided during discovery, Pam stated firmly. This represents a serious privacy violation and further suggests coordination between the plaintiff and external parties to build a false case against my client. The judge's expression darkened. Ms. Bondi, that's an extraordinary claim. Are you suggesting impropriety by opposing counsel? I'm stating facts, Your Honor, Pam replied, her voice steady. Facts that form a disturbing pattern. Watch yourself, counsel, Judge Montgomery warned. Unfounded accusations in my courtroom can result in sanctions. I understand, Your Honor, Pam said, remaining composed. Good, the judge replied, because I'm not impressed by dramatic performances from federal officials. Stick to provable facts. Your Honor, Pam said quietly, may I approach the bench with Mr. Preston? The judge waved them forward. What issues? He asked impatiently once they stood before him. First, the unauthorized access of my client's medical records, Pam began. Second, the unusual speed with which this foreclosure was processed. Ms. Bondi, foreclosures follow standard timelines, the judge cut her off. Not when they skip mandatory mediation steps and cooling off periods, Pam replied evenly. This case bypassed 3 required procedural stages. Preston interjected smoothly. Your Honor, given the clear evidence of default, the bank exercised its right to expedite proceedings under Section 4.3 of the mortgage agreement. Judge Montgomery nodded. That seems reasonable. Section 4.3 only applies in cases of intentional default or fraud by the borrower, Pam countered. Neither condition exists here, making the expedited process improper. The judge's expression hardened. Ms. Bondi, Mr. Preston has far more experience with banking regulations than you appear to have in this context. I'm inclined to accept his interpretation. Pam remained silent, and the judge took her silence as defeat. Let's return to open court, he announced loudly. Perhaps Ms. Bondi can present actual evidence rather than procedural complaints. Back at their tables, Judge Montgomery continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Ms. Bondi, in my courtroom, we value efficiency and expertise. Do you have any substantive arguments to present, or should we conclude this matter? Pam finally stood, her expression unchanged. Your Honor, I'd like to enter several documents into evidence. Proceed, Montgomery sighed theatrically. First, Exhibit A, Mrs. Wilson's complete payment history, certified by 2 independent auditors, Pam said, handing the documents to the clerk. Second, Exhibit B, internal communications from Midwest Banking Corporation discussing what they call Operation Harvest, a program targeting properties in appreciating neighborhoods owned by elderly individuals with significant equity, she continued. The judge's head snapped up. What is this? Communications obtained legally through a whistleblower, Your Honor, Pam replied calmly. And finally, Exhibit C, financial disclosures showing property investments made through shell companies, partially owned by several prominent individuals. What exactly are you implying, counsel? Judge Montgomery demanded, his face flushing. I'm not implying anything, Your Honor, Pam said, meeting his gaze directly. The documents speak for themselves. Ms. Bondi, the judge said through clenched teeth, approach the bench. Mr. Preston, you too. At the bench, Judge Montgomery's voice was low and threatening. What exactly do you think you're doing? Presenting relevant evidence in my client's case, Your Honor, Pam replied evenly. These allegations are preposterous, Preston interjected. This so-called Operation Harvest document is likely fabricated, and these financial records, even if authentic, have no bearing on Mrs. Wilson's defaulted mortgage. I agree, the judge nodded. Ms. Bondi, I'm excluding these documents as irrelevant and potentially defamatory. Your Honor, respectfully, you cannot exclude these documents, Pam said. Federal Rules of Evidence 401 and 402 clearly establish that evidence having any tendency to make a fact more or less probable is relevant and admissible unless specifically excluded by the Constitution, federal statutes, or other rules. I'm aware of the federal rules, counsel, the judge snapped. I determine relevance in my courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, Pam continued calmly. However, in Hutchinson versus Hensley, the Supreme Court established that evidence suggesting systematic targeting of vulnerable homeowners is always relevant in contested foreclosure cases. I'm not familiar with that case, Preston frowned. 2018, Your Honor, Pam said. Justice Kagan wrote the majority opinion. If you're deliberately misrepresenting precedent, the judge began. I would never do that, Your Honor, Pam interrupted, reaching into her portfolio. I have the relevant excerpt here. Your Honor, Pam continued, addressing the court, I'd like to call our first witness, Michael Turner, former data analyst at Midwest Banking Corporation, and the whistleblower who provided the Operation Harvest documents. Objection, Preston nearly shouted. We received no witness list from opposing counsel. Actually, Mr. Preston, Pam turned to him, I submitted my complete witness list 3 weeks ago. I have the certified mail receipt and the court clerk's acknowledgement. Mr. Turner was listed as witness number 3. She's correct, Your Honor, the clerk confirmed nervously. The witness list was properly filed. Did you receive this witness list, Mr. Preston? Judge Montgomery asked, his composure visibly cracking. I would need to check with my team, Preston hesitated. Perhaps Mr. Preston was too busy accessing my client's private medical records to review properly submitted discovery materials, Pam said. Your Honor, Pam continued, before Mr. Turner testifies, I believe the court should be aware that the shell company mentioned in Exhibit C, Mountain View Properties, lists among its beneficial owners a William Montgomery. I'm curious if that's merely a coincidence. These proceedings will be in recess for 15 minutes, Judge Montgomery announced, his voice strained. Counsel for both parties in my chambers now. This is outrageous, Judge Montgomery began once they were in his chambers. Ms. Bondi, you're walking a dangerous line with these unfounded insinuations. With respect, Your Honor, Pam replied calmly, nothing I presented is unfounded. The documentation is extensive and verified. This is clearly a desperate attempt to distract from the simple facts of the case, Preston interjected. Mrs. Wilson missed payments. The bank has the right to foreclose. If I may, Pam said, placing 3 documents on the judge's desk, I'd like to clarify several points. First, the complete audit showing Mrs. Wilson never missed a payment. Second, internal Midwest Banking communications specifically identifying her property as a harvest target due to its location and her age. And third, property records showing that foreclosed homes from this program were consistently purchased at auction by Mountain View Properties, often at 40% below market value. What exactly are you suggesting? Judge Montgomery demanded. I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor, Pam replied. I'm demonstrating a pattern. The bank falsifies payment records for targeted homeowners, expedites foreclosures, bypassing normal consumer protections, and then a shell company purchases these properties at deflated prices. The shell company's investors, including yourself, then benefit from substantial returns when the properties are redeveloped or resold. Your Honor, this is absurd, Preston said, his face pale. Is it? Pam interrupted, pulling out another document. This is your firm's billing record for operational consulting, Project Harvest, over the past 3 years. Your firm has billed over $2 million for work on this specific program. That's enough, the judge stood abruptly. This case is being reassigned. I'll recuse myself due to Ms. Bondi's outrageous accusations. Recusal would be appropriate, Pam agreed. However, reassignment won't be necessary. What do you mean? The judge demanded. As we speak, the FBI is executing search warrants at Midwest Banking Corporation, Preston and Associates, and Mountain View Properties offices, Pam explained. They're also seizing the banking records Your Honor attempted to seal last month in the Martinez case. You were building a case all along, Judge Montgomery said, the color draining from his face. Yes, Your Honor, Pam replied. Your financial entanglements with Midwest Banking and Mountain View made you a person of interest early in the investigation. Your treatment of me today was predictable. Two men in suits entered, showing FBI credentials. Judge William Montgomery, one said formally, we need you to come with us to answer some questions. I need to call my attorney, Preston stood shakily. That would be advisable, Pam noted, though you might want to find representation outside your firm. You played us. The judge turned to Pam as the agents escorted him out. No, Your Honor, Pam replied. You played yourself. I just followed the evidence. When Pam returned to the courtroom, Mrs. Wilson clutched her purse anxiously. What's happening? She whispered as Pam sat beside her. Justice, Mrs. Wilson, Pam replied softly. Finally, justice. The courtroom doors opened again as two FBI agents escorted Judge Montgomery out, followed by additional agents leading a visibly shaken James Preston. The court clerk approached Pam, looking bewildered. Ms. Bondi, what should we do about today's proceedings? I believe Judge Harmison from the Fourth Circuit is available to take over, Pam suggested. I've already spoken with the administrative office about the situation. Judge Eliza Harmison, in her 60s with a reputation for fierce independence and ethical standards, spoke up. Court will come to order, she announced, her authoritative voice immediately quieting the room. I've been briefed on the extraordinary circumstances here. This court will recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., at which point we will restart these proceedings properly. I don't understand everything that happened, Mrs. Wilson said to Pam once they were in a quiet consultation room, but I know you saved my home. It was never just about your home, Mrs. Wilson, Pam smiled. This scheme has hurt dozens of families. The evidence we gathered will help all of them. Richard Barnes burst into the room, his eyes wide. Pam, it's all over the courthouse. Montgomery and Preston taken out by the FBI. What did you do? My job, she replied simply. But how? He stammered. I've been working with federal prosecutors since last year, Pam explained. After I noticed the pattern in foreclosure cases, I took my concerns to them. They were already investigating the bank for other irregularities. All those times I worried you weren't suited for these smaller cases. Richard shook his head in amazement. That perception was useful, Pam noted. Being underestimated gave me access no one else could have had. You're not what you seem, are you? Mrs. Wilson took Pam's hand. None of us are, Mrs. Wilson. Pam squeezed the elderly woman's hand gently. That's the lesson here. 1 month later, Pam sat in her office reviewing case files. The aftermath of what the press had dubbed the Harvest Scandal continued to unfold across front pages nationwide. Judge Montgomery had resigned from the bench and was now facing federal charges for corruption, fraud, and racketeering. James Preston and 3 other partners at his firm had been indicted. Midwest Banking Corporation's stock had plummeted, and class action lawsuits were mounting. Richard entered, carrying a newspaper. Still making headlines, he remarked, tossing the paper on her desk. The front page story detailed how federal investigators had expanded their probe to 5 other states where similar foreclosure schemes had been identified. The justice system works slowly, but it does work, Pam replied. The partners want to talk about leveraging your name for a new initiative, Richard said, taking a seat across from her. Your reputation has become quite the asset. I'm not interested in being anyone's asset. Pam smiled slightly. Then what are you interested in? He asked. Before she could answer, her phone rang. She checked the caller ID, U.S. Attorney's Office. I need to take this, she said. Richard nodded and left as Pam answered. After a brief conversation, she hung up. The U.S. Attorney had just offered her a position leading a new task force on financial crimes against vulnerable populations. It was meaningful work that would allow her to help more people like Mrs. Wilson. Her computer chimed with an email notification. It was from Mrs. Wilson, with photos attached of her grandchildren visiting her at the home she had almost lost. The subject line read simply, "Thank you for fighting when no one else would." That evening, as Pam cleared out her office, having accepted the U.S. Attorney's offer, she reflected on the events that had led her here. Judge Montgomery had seen a federal official he thought he could intimidate. He never suspected she had quietly built a case that would bring down an entire corrupt network. "You played us," she recalled the judge's words in his chambers. She hadn't corrected him then, but the truth was simpler. She had merely been patient, thorough, and unbending in her pursuit of justice. The corruption had exposed itself when someone was willing to look closely enough. Life teaches us that appearances can be deceiving, and judgment often clouds the truth. Has someone underestimated you only to be surprised by your capabilities? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about a time when you proved someone wrong through your actions rather than words. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and unexpected brilliance, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us all why we should never judge a book by its cover. Where are you watching from today? Let us know.